Looking back on the week that was and forward to the week ahead. It's the Fantasy Football Hustle. Here are your hosts, Brian Drake and Dwain McFarland.
When you hear that music, folks, you know what that means. We're talking fantasy football. Good times are ahead. Welcome in. It's the Fantasy Football Hustle. I am Brian Drake from FightingChanceFantasy.com. You know him. You love him. My co-host. He's on PFF. He's on ETR. He's Dwain McFarland. What's up, brother?
What's up, man? You have some crazy weather going on up there right now. It's like 65 here. You know, I went for a run this afternoon with my dog. Sun's out, shining. You know, it's like California weather.
It's like that here in Syracuse all the time. The weather here in Syracuse is so good. You know, it's about 10 degrees and we got about 5 inches of snow that I had to bring in another Syracuse guy to talk about it. So we're going to double team you. We're not even going to talk fantasy today. We're breaking down 2-3 zone. Jim Boeheim might talk a little lacrosse. We'll see where the hour takes us, but we're so happy to bring in Jordan McNamara. He is the author of the Analytics of Dynasty draft guide. You can go to why can I not say analytics?
The Analytics of Dynasty. There you go, guys. You guys have never had to see me jump in for Drake before. There's a first time for everything.
I designed a T-shirt for you, Dwain, that says Analytical Assassin. I had to type that 700 times. And now that I have it written down, see, this is what I do. This is a little behind the curtain here to make sure that I don't screw up people's names. I just write it in a Sharpie and I tape it above my computer. And, so anyways, folks, the Analytics of Dynasty. It's our good friend, Jordan McNamara. How are you? Welcome to the party.
I'm happy to be here. I'm great. I got to say, I don't think I've ever told you this, Brian. I actually called in the Jim Boeheim show one time. It must have been like last year. And I was really interested to know what Jim Boeheim's take on analytics was. So I just asked him, what role does analytics play? Because when you watch them, the answer is zero role. And it was about the answer that you would expect. So, the 17-footer has not, the 17-foot 2-point shot has not died in Syracuse, which can't come soon enough.
It's funny because this week everyone's all up in arms about Mike Krzyzewski kind of reaming out and making a college kid look bad. He's a reporter. He's asking a question. Jim Boeheim's made a living doing that for 40 years. in those locker rooms where Jim Boeheim points to you and he's like, what do you know about basketball? How many games have you ever coached? And it's like, buddy, I'm trying to just get out of here. Like, I'm got buddies at the bar. Like, can I write this down? I got a deadline. But, hey, it is what it is. So you have done a really interesting thing here, and you've kind of made dynasty football your niche, but not just saying, and we talked about this before the show, hey, here's the top 20 guys coming out in the 2021 draft. You should draft them in this order. And Dwain, you can explain it a lot better than I can. There is a method to the madness. So break it down like how you did before the show.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead, Jordan. I thought you were throwing to me, Brian.
I wanted Dwain to break it down, like what he said about you.
Go ahead, Dwain. Yeah, no, go ahead. You can put it better than I can for sure.
No, Jordan, I'm sure you can do the best. It's yours. But what I love about what you do, this is what we were chatting about before the show. You're not just saying, hey, here are the prospects. This is the way I grade them. And there's analytics that go into that too, right? And you were even talking about some of the things that you've done that, what's predictive, what's not predictive, what do you pay attention to, what's noise, all that kind of stuff. But what I love about what you do is really you've formulated it, into a strategy. So great. You have all this information. You have all of this data. If you know what the right data is to be looking at, what the right data is to be focusing on, even that's not enough. It's like, what do you do with it, right? How do you prioritize it? How do you fit it into a plan? How do you make it actionable, right, is what I think about. So when I think about our audience, like our top show every year is the draft plan. Like people go nuts for that because you're taking all that context you've given them over the offseason, right, around players, their new roles, new coaching schemes, all that stuff, right, that comes together. but now you're actually putting it into a plan of how they actually go do something with it and kick everybody's ass, right, in their league. And so that's what I love really about what you do. Like, you're very thoughtful. You think ahead. You know, we always talk about playing chess, not checkers on this show. And I think you're like that true chess player. You know, that's probably not even doing you justice. Like, you're beyond chess. Like, you're really thinking multiple moves ahead, which is super, super important. It's important in season long, but like, it's critical in dynasty football, knowing when to get off certain players, knowing when to buy into others. So I'm super excited to have you on the show. So let's hop in.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk some strategy for sure.
So when you started to create this, what was kind of your mindset? Because there's a very, very rabid segment of the fantasy football population that are these dynasty guys. You know, I think there's guys who play in a lot of home leagues. Maybe they got a dynasty league or two, but there are some folks, they have 20 dynasty leagues and all they focus on is this, you know, who's coming out next? How do I get ahead of the curve? Can I get rid of this guy a year early? Should I buy this guy kind of on the dip? So what made you say, like, I want to dig a little deeper and go further and create the Analytics of Dynasty guide that you can go to analyticsofdynasty.com and purchase? Like, what was kind of the mindset? Why did you go and do all this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in 2017 NFL season, I tried to get into DFS, and I started playing. Like, I actually had a really good week one, and it was like Tyreek Hill fueled just bombardment. I think he went for like 3 touchdowns and 250 or some crazy thing, and I actually did pretty well that week. And then I sort of struggled over the next 3 or 4 weeks, and I was like, you know, I don't have a good enough grasp of sort of the numbers and what to expect, and sort of I got to do some more research until I feel really comfortable playing this. So I stopped playing it and said I'll come back to it in the off season. So spring of 2018, or really January, February, March of 2018, I was like, I'm going to do a ton of DFS research, like, and just get really good at it, just to have an idea of players and profiles and this sort of thing. And so I did all of this research, and I had been doing podcasts. You know, I was at UTH we'd been doing podcasts there, and I was really in the dynasty space, but I wanted to take this jump into DFS, do all this research, and all it keeps jumping back to me is all these dynasty findings. So I was like, all right. So I just started writing stuff down, and it was like, by the time I just had like written down notes, it was like 40 pages long. And I was like, wow, I can actually, there's like a lot here. So I kicked around the idea. I ended up writing it, and it was more of an excuse to continue to do research so I could tell my wife that I was actually doing something with it. So I wrote the first one, and then it was well received. And so I didn't intend to write a second one or a third one. I just intended to write the first one because there was a lot there. And then as I sort of kept looking at it more, I just kept looking at it in different ways. And so I found a lot of stuff for the second one that was in 2020, and this third one in 2021. It has a little bit different of a feel in terms of some of the stuff that I did. I actually have some contributors on this one, which is fun, which I hadn't done the first 2 years. And I actually looked a lot at value and cost, which is something that is kind of tough to do. And I hadn't done in the first couple of years. But now this one, there's a lot of stuff in terms of like what players should cost and what players' profiles should cost. And, you know, and then once you know that, right, that's the key, right? You can look at profiles and you can look at strategy, but once you can see the cost where there's absolute value and where there's like total avoids, right, that's a really critical thing to know. So I have a lot of that in this one that wasn't really stuff I had access to in the first 2 editions. So this one I'm really excited about because it's a lot different than the first 2.
There's 8 chapters in the guide. And I mean, I'm telling you folks, I'm flipping through it right now. He's got stuff like trade calculators, chapters called Be Willing to Lose, some startup draft strategies, goes position by position. But your favorite chapter is the team building strategy, and that is chapter number 1. And if you go over to analyticsofdynasty.com for just $20, you can get your hands on this. I highly recommend that you do. Why is team building strategy your favorite segment? And I know Dwain's going to be excited to talk about this because this is kind of what we do here on the Hustle. So I think we can get a lot of mileage out of this. Why did you love this segment so much?
Yeah. So one of the things, like my favorite time of year tends to be the off season because you get to, it's slower paced for sure, but you also get to look at different strategy stuff. And so there will be weeks and months where I won't pay particularly close attention to NFL stuff, but I'll be thinking about other strategies. So whether that's, how do we incorporate business, or how do we incorporate, one thing I think is really interesting for Dynasty and fantasy football in general is using NBA strategies, right? Because the rosters are pretty close to the same size, right? They're a lot of the things in that in terms of the picks have much more similar values and than compared to the NFL, right? You can use a lot of those different strategies. One player can really impact your team, where an NFL thing doesn't really quite as much have that impact. So you can sort of look at those strategies, and that was something that I really found a ton of interest in and looking at. So that, and then, there's all sorts of strategies, right? So basketball analytics is big for me because it allows me to steal ideas. But I also looked at just other strategic thinking stuff, right? So one of the things that I found in the a great thing is there's a woman by the name of Susie Welch, and she wrote a book called 10-10-10. And it's basically 10 minutes, 10 months, and 10 years, like basically looking at decisions through those lenses. And it's an analogy really to, short-term, medium-term, and long-term thinking. And so I put a different spin on it, which was 2-2-2. And you can change the numbers a little bit. I think we tend to look at that long-term number too far down the line because it's really tough to predict stuff 5 years out. And I think if people were honest with themselves, they would realize that they probably don't do that as well as they actually do. So I use 2-2-2, right? 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, in terms of ways to look at decisions. And you can look at any decision through all of those lenses. And each one you have to weight differently, right? If you're making a trade for a really low cost, weekly fill-in, the 2 weeks matters more than the 2 years. Whereas if you're in a startup draft, right, I actually think that the 2 week window, right, and I talked about this in the book, right, each pick that you make should shape the rest of your startup draft, right? Same thing to your rookie draft to a lesser extent, but really in your startup draft or when you're making a trade, right, you should think about what the follow-on consequences are, not even just 2 years down the line, but 2 weeks. And too often people will say, well, I have a strength at this position. I can't possibly, add to it, right? Or, I don't need this position, so I'm not going to take it. Really, what you need to do is build a long-term team. And sometimes the easiest way is just to take the best player, take the player that will actually add to your strength, and then you can pivot off of it in the next 2 weeks or 2 months to make your 2-year team better. So that was one of the things I really found. And when you start looking at it, and I actually putting together, and you actually know my editor, so putting together the book, we had a long discussion about where to put this chapter, and we ultimately went with it first, just because it's thinking about how you should think about the rest of the book, essentially.
Now, this is Senior Bowl week. Everyone is so excited about, hey, look, we've got some, tight end who's never going to get drafted, and he's 6'5" and he's 230, and people go crazy for that on Twitter right now. I hate it. It literally, folks, there's nothing I hate more than just seeing weight and height and speed measurements for all these guys. I don't care at all. But I think so many folks go into their rookie draft in an established league and they have no clue who some of these guys are. They're going to know this year, hey, I know who Devonta Smith is. I know who Travis Etienne is. I know a couple of the quarterbacks. Then after the first 5 picks, they're lost. They have no idea. So then you get to the end of the first round and you're like, I don't know. I don't know. What advice do you have for them? And maybe how can your guide help some of these folks to make sure they're not making poor decisions that are going to impact their team, like you said, this year and 2-3 years down the line?
So one of the things I looked at in the 2020 edition was something that I call base rates. And a base rate is just simply what's the odds of a certain situation happening, right? Of a similar situation in the past. What's the odds that that's happened? And you can sort of use that to formulate your analysis in the present. So the easiest way to do that is to think about position and draft round in the NFL draft, right? So if we know that, for example, first round wide receivers, they hit about 55% of the time for a top 24 season in their career. And that number is really I think a lot lower than people will would appreciate, right? And those things move too, right? So we know that, with Jalen Reagor missing, right, that drops to, somewhere in the high 40s, right? A miss in the first year drops to about the high 40s. And then when a guy like Justin Jefferson hits, it puts him in a whole different strata. It puts him in a density, what I call density instead of a base rate, which is how dense their hit is once they've hit. So that would be I think you could just use base rates and not make horrible decisions, right? And that's kind of what I think you need to think about players in ranges of outcomes and understanding player profiles. And for me, it's getting a lot of getting player profiles and when you can get them at discounts, right? So guys that I've I was on AJ Dillon a ton last year because I thought, hey, there's a really good chance that he could be a 2021 starting running back, and I'm getting a pretty big discount off of him, off of guys like Cam Akers and J.K. Dobbins, who both of them were going around higher in rookie drafts and weren't expected to be year one starters, right? So I said, if I'm going to basically wait, maybe 8 to 10 weeks, right, I'm going to sacrifice that, and I'm getting a full round of discount on that. I'm not really losing all that much, right? So that was really looking at him and understanding that historically his profiles hit 55% of the time for a top 24 season, right? When you're getting that in the second round of rookie drafts where you're expecting half of that, right? That's an enormous value, and it makes him a clear target player, right? Same thing with looking at guys like Brandon Ayuk, right? Brandon Ayuk was going behind guys that were going in the second round of rookie drafts. Or in the second round of the NFL draft. That's a horrible bet historically, horrible bet to take second round wide receiver over a first round wide receiver, just in general. So you have you go there, you understand that rule, and you say, all right, am I really going to make an exception in this case to this general rule? I think thinking about those things, there's 4 or 5 different things you can think about in terms of all the positions. And once you sort of do that, and I lay it out in this edition too, when you sort of look at those things, you can understand, all right, here's sort of what I'm looking for, and then start with that. And then you can say, all right, I can pivot off of that a little bit if I have a particularly strong case on a player or whatnot. But I really start with just the base rate and understanding the hit rates of players in particular rounds and drafts and the different positions which they go in.
So how do you add on to that, right? So you've got your base rates, but obviously you want to improve on that without giving too much away. What are some of the other key things that you focus on? We talked a little bit before the show, you even mentioned, we probably focus a little bit too much on some of the wrong things, and there's other things that we could really be paying more attention to. So again, I don't want to give away the secret sauce here. We want people to buy the book, support what you're doing because it's great work, but just what can you share with our listeners, really along those lines?
Yeah, so I was really excited this edition. I think I said earlier I had contributors, and one of the things that I wanted someone to write was what matters in terms of rookie metrics, right? Because I think that's a great question. So he it's actually Peter Howard from Dynasty Crossroads podcast. He actually wrote the chapter, so it's great. And so he looks at a lot of the things. For me, I think we can really get confused or really get disoriented is really the right word with all of the stuff that's coming at you, right? And I joke that you could probably do, if you turned out from now until May and did your rookie draft then without any information about the pre-draft process other than where they went in the NFL draft, you could probably still do okay, right? If you just did that. Because I do think people get themselves spun around, and then what you'll see is that the market will make classic mistakes. They won't react to what matters the most, which is NFL draft pedigree. And so you'll see mistakes like Hakeem Butler made in the second round of rookie drafts, where you're taking a 5% bet where you need to be taking 35% bet, right? That's just you can't do that. You just can't. So that's one of the things I really look at. I think you can lay, if there's 2 things that I would look at, right? I would understand the base rate, and then I would break it down positionally. It matters to some degree. And let me take a step back. the pedigree is a little bit different too, right? So just to say first round quarterbacks doesn't really do it justice. So I really break down, I sort of split the round in two, right? And top 10 quarterbacks, and then non-top 10 quarterbacks, because they perform a lot different.
Sure.
And you let the data tell you that, right? You look back historically and you start to see where are these breaks. You're not just, it's not an arbitrary, let's make it top 10. Like, so for each position, that number could be a little different. Yeah.
And I found it doesn't much, and the problem too is sample size, right? So it actually worked out decent that there was pretty close. That 10 cutoff, it was pretty close for both running back, or for both quarterback and wide receiver. But at tight end, I think there's two guys that have been there, right? So it's just tough for tight end. And with running back too, there's some reasons that I'm not entirely certain that it much matters, that big difference, but
you can't say running backs and don't matter. I mean, come on, that's like too in style now,
I mean, if you're a first round running back, like the hit rate on that's enormous, right? And I do think there's the guys that go higher, it's probably into the weeds a little bit, but maybe we won't see that quite as much too. So but for me, I think if there's two things that I were to take, understand the base rate, and then I would look at, for wide receiver, breakout age, right? When they broke out, you can do it a number of different ways, and breakout age usually measures what's called dominator rating. So that's the percentage of your team's yards plus the percentage of your team's touchdowns that you had divided by 2, right? So you average those 2 out. And that'll give you, and then I sort of look at those guys, right? And so this was I'll give you an example of how I apply this, right?
Like, so the Dominator is a great example of that's what kicked Ruggs out, right? A lot of people's analysis this last year of, even though he's a first round pick,
right,
really he's not checking all the boxes you want for what his price is probably going to be. And he did end up slipping in some dynasty drafts, but that was a key component, right?
Correct. And so then when you looked at a guy like Brandon Ayuk versus Ruggs, and when you sort of looked at that breakout stuff, and Ayuk, he went JUCO too, so that was a little bit more complicated, but he actually broke out, whereas Ruggs didn't. So when you sort of, Ruggs went higher in the draft, but you sort of can, and Brandon Ayuk was going much cheaper too. So, so that's really one of the things, like, I think you look at those profiles, and then you also look at cost, right? And so, I think we get too locked into thinking we know the right answer, right? So that's to say, if we, people get both situationally, right? The Clyde Edwards-Helaire, the situation, and he's going to Kansas City, it's the greatest thing ever. I had some thoughts about that. I didn't think that was actually true. But when you'll see the market move way away from where the base rate should be, right? Where the profile should be. And when that happens, you need to act on it, right? So, AJ Dillon was a good example of this past year, right? He was going way below, right? People were really docking him because they thought he wasn't going to be a starter this year, and we'll see what the future holds. But that's a classic example of a cheap investment that you make. The other one that I had, right, when I looked at the wide receivers last year, and I didn't go all in on this because I sort of found some of this research after, in writing this book, which was after the rookie drafts last year. But I took Jalen Reagor at wide receiver 1. And if I were to go back and do it all over again, he would still be my wide receiver 1. That's not where the process failure was. And again, some of this could be randomness, but I do think the mistake that I made, and the numbers have told me this, is once you sort of take the wide receivers and you look at their breakout age and you sort of say, all right, and for me, I look at guys that have broken out at 18 or 19, and then I look at guys that broke out older than that, and then I look at guys that didn't break out, right? So there's 3 different groups. If I take the guys that just broke out at 18 and 19, right, a lot of the ordering in terms of how ADP does with them, it's not predictive, right? In terms of when you split them up in terms of NFL draft pedigree, in terms of, once you're looking at them within a round, the order in which they go in the round is not predictive. And so when you think about that, right, you have to think about, okay, if we're not doing a particularly good job of discerning what order these guys should go in, neither is the NFL draft, in specifics within the round, how do we sort of exploit that? So one of the tactics I did was, I didn't do this enough, but I I traded off of Judy for Jefferson, right? So I slid back 2 or 3 picks. I picked up an extra piece, and I saw those profiles as being largely the same. I think a lot of folks didn't see Jefferson as being the same as the top 3 guys, right? Most of the market had Lamb and Judy above Rager and Jefferson, and I think Jefferson was a clear 4 for, if you sort of look at the market in general. The other 3 were closer. He was much more off the back of that tier than he was in that tier. And that was a mistake, right? And I think the reason why that's a mistake is because they're basically the same profile. Jefferson arguably could have had a better one in terms of, how high the breakout was and all that stuff. But when you sort of look at them together, when there's a clear split between them, that's the situation to attack. We've seen that with quarterbacks too, right? The Josh Allen experience. Josh Allen's going to be probably misused for the rest of NFL eternity in terms of as a prototype. But one of the things was, right, there's a round difference between him and some of the other guys in that class, him and Darnold, right? And they were all top 10 guys, right? The pedigree wasn't that much different. Herbert last year, right? Herbert, a 6 to 8 pick spread between him and Tua opened up. And, historically that's not great, right? That's something that you need to close down. And so really identifying those profiles that look the same and then taking the cheaper one. And then figuring out ways to do that where you can add stuff to it, right? So trade down from Tua to Herbert plus, right? Or trade down from, Burrow to Herbert plus if you want to get really risky, do those things, right? So that's really the way that I look at it is, but you look at profiles and then try and figure out ways to tinker with the base rate. And then you look at cost. And I think blending those is the easiest way. And there's other metrics and there's other things you can look at for sure. But I think in the simplest way, it's the profile and it's the cost and try and figure out ways that to get cheaper ones at better that are the same profiles.
We're hanging out with Jordan McNamara. He is the author of The Analytics of Dynasty. You can go over to analyticsofdynasty.com and pick up this year's publication for just $20. And it's going to really help your squad going forward this year. If you're just starting up in a Dynasty league or if you've got a couple going, trust me, it's worth the money. Go over there and help our friend out. You mentioned Breakout Age, and I'd love to get your thought on this because it's kind of the buzz with some of the top wide receivers here coming out. The Alabama kids are both 22 years old. Jamar Chase has not yet turned 21. Now, in the grand scheme of things, could they get drafted? And hey, they're both, or 3 of them are great for 5, 6, 7 years. Does that matter to you, that this slight age gap between the 3 guys?
For me, I look at the breakout age of when they're basically the youngest age at which they broke out, because that's the best indicator, right? Mm-hmm. So if a guy breaks out at 18, that's much better than if a guy breaks out at 21.
And you're talking about dominator again, like
dominator,
in the percentage that you're wanting them to get to, kind of fill folks in a little bit, like on how you work that.
Yeah, so it's dominator rating. It's the percentage of, it's called market share of receiving yards. So the percentage of your team's receiving yards. So if your team throws for 4,000 yards and you have 1,000 of them, you have 25%. If you throw for 40 touchdowns and you have 10, right, you have 25% of the touchdowns. You average those 2 together, and in that example, it's 20. You have a 25% dominator rating. Mm-hmm. That's much better at 18 years old than it is at 22. Mm-hmm. Right. There's a significant difference in terms of those 2 things. Right. So I look at those, I look at when the initial, when you go above 20%, and then, and then I also look at 30%. The problem, with some of these things is you get smaller sample sizes, you got to be careful. In terms of some of these things, but yeah, I mean, that's something I definitely look at. And so
how important, Jordan, how important is consistency? So what if you have, because this is one, that gets talked a lot about in the community. I know people have questions. So let's say you've got somebody that breaks out early, but then falls off as a sophomore and then maybe come back, in this example is average, right, as a junior. And now he's coming into the draft. Like, how do you factor in, those components?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think draft pedigree is the thing that will tell you the answer to that question, right? So if you get an 18-year-old breakout and he goes in the 5th round of the NFL draft, Tyler Johnson was an example of this, right? Yeah. He had a really elite breakout in college and he went on day 3. Like, you have to say, okay, I really like the profile, but the draft pedigree, I mean, that's pointing to a 10 to 15% hit rate. You just can't, right? You have to adjust for that. That's not a 2nd round rookie pick, right? That's a 3rd or 4th round rookie pick. So you have to understand that. Diggs is a good example of this, right? Diggs is, if you were sort of bargain shopping, I think as a general strategy, you should not take day 3 wide receivers on your in your rookie drafts. I think you should just blanket avoid them just because the hit rate's so low. But Diggs is an example of a guy that broke out at 18 years old, did really well, Maryland, I believe. And then his career sort of went off the track. I think there was a coaching change. He got hurt, goes on day 3, right? So I had this really interesting profile that goes on day 3 because of a lot of the things that you talked about. The arc of it was, of his college career, was downhill, and that's kind of how the NFL treated it. So I really think that the NFL, especially when they pass on players, it tells you a lot, right? It tells you that there's something there in terms of them and them passing. And it's a little bit different when you get guys that go really high that you don't know how many people had him that high, right? Like, you don't know how many people would have taken John Ross as a top 10 pick, but you know that one team did, right? But if you get a guy that falls out of the draft, or, that you pass multiple rounds on, that's a different, that tells you a lot of information.
Multiple data points.
Yeah.
If you want to ask Jordan a question on Twitter, you find him at McNamara Dynasty. If you want to ask him one here on our YouTube channel, you just fire away and I'll put it up on the screen. Our buddy Sam Cooney asks, typically drafts are not as loaded as this 2020, I don't know, he says 2022 class, correct? This is my first year doing Dynasty and wondering if this class was a huge anomaly.
Yeah. So I looked at, I actually looked at the average. I went back in this book actually and looked at the the draft since 2008, and it was really interesting because when you sort of look at ADP, or average draft position for rookies, I have it going back 12, 13 years now. You can sort of say, all right, well, who are the guys that went in the 1st round of the draft? And then you can say, all right, what's the average? And I looked at some of the different ranges of the draft. And then say, hey, who's basically above a first, who qualifies being above average 1st round pick for each position. And I believe, I think if you categorize Lynn Bowden as a running back, which he was, it was 14 guys that qualified above average 1st round rookie pick pedigree, which is the most that's we've ever seen. So since 2008. So yeah, it was. I think it was an absolutely loaded class. Will we see that again? Probably. It's going to revert somewhere to its mean. We'll see sort of with the draft pedigree in this year where that all turns out. But this was a really good class. I think this one, 2021, is going to be good, probably in different ways too. So depending on what positions you're looking for and those sorts of things.
Well, our pal Robert Garcia wants to know about the quarterback position. He asks, in a Superflex Dynasty League, knowing that we aren't good at predicting rookie QBs, does it make more sense to not pick QBs high, but rather pay up for proven QBs than draft the rookies?
That's a great question, and that's a philosophical debate that'll go on for the end of time. I think that, generally speaking, we overestimate how good the young quarterbacks will be. So we look at these guys, and the odds that a top 10 quarterback produces 2 top 12 seasons in his career is like 40%. And so less than half of them are going to produce, and top 12 isn't that high, right? It's not, you're not talking league winners. You're just talking baseline starters. And it's less than half of them. And so when you truly get to the elite levels of the position, it's not that many guys do it. So I do think, it's a blend of cost and it's a blend of profile, right? So, if I'm sitting at 1 in a super flex league, like Trevor Lawrence is going to be the stock 101, what's it worth to trade down to 2 or 3, what can I get there? That's a really interesting debate, right? To what you would take, right? And I've thought a lot of different ways about pivoting off of that pick if you have it, and sort of what that trade would look like, what you would need to do it. And I would probably look at it in a different way. I think the market thinks that Trevor Lawrence is a certainty. I don't. I don't think that any players up that high are certainties, because we've, just historically, it's not true. But maybe I would say he's higher than what you would expect your average rate to be, but I do think there's other ways to exploit it. So if in a startup draft, I mean, I think and in an existing league, I think you definitely run at the quarterback position. You want to run a certainty, right? So I actually did an exercise. I don't think and Schefter said something this week that it seems incredible to me, but he would take the over on 18 different quarterback situations changing this offseason. I think that's impossible, but it's more close than we've seen in prior years, right? I think it's certainly possible that it's going to be higher than prior years. I thought 18 was an overstatement, but it's not outrageously insane. It didn't seem all that likely. But I do think we're going to see a lot of that change. So I do think running to safety right now and get guys that are actually, rock solid profiles, I think that makes a lot of sense right now in terms of going to a position that I think you're going to see a lot of upheaval and you don't want to take huge hits on. And so, for me, I think there's a huge gap between guys that have already done it. And we know, talking about like Dak Prescott versus a guy like Trevor Lawrence, who people want to put up there, right? That's a no-brainer in favor of Dak Prescott historically.
I want to ask both of you guys this question, and I see it on Twitter all the time. And it's really the question of trading first-round rookie picks, specifically maybe later first-round rookie picks or future first-round rookie picks for established talent. So somebody could say like, hey, I've got the 111 in my league this year, but someone's looking to trade me Ezekiel Elliott, let's just say something like that. Like, would you make that trade? Because everybody loves the shiny new toy. It's that unknown factor of like, oh my God, I could get, the next Barry Sanders or something. But realistically, if you're at the last couple of picks of the first round, you might get a dud. I mean, Jesus, I took Sean Vaughn at the end of a pick last year in the first round. So what are your guys' thoughts on that?
I mean, for me, like it really depends on where, the owner is like in their strategy for their team, right? I mean, are they in a window where they're trying to win? Like taking the example you just gave, Drake, if you're in a window where you're trying to win right now, like, and I think Jordan, all the tenets that he's laid out would still hold true, right? You got to make sure that you think you're getting the right value, that the trade makes sense. But for me, a lot of it does come down to the team context, right? So if say Zeke's my RB1, right, and now I'm going to have say I got a decent RB2, but I'm going to have a hole at RB3, and I say I won the championship last year. If I'm picking at 11, right, that means I probably finished second, unless you've got a lottery system, and I think I've got another shot at it. Then I'm, if I can go get Zeke, for that pick 11, I'm probably doing it. If I'm the guy trading away Zeke, and I'm still in that window and it's about what I'm going to get at pick 11, it just really depends on, the construct of my team. And all these dynasty leagues, like we kind of use a blanket statement, but really they're all very different, right? You have things from Devi, which that's a total different thing than just a normal dynasty league, where you always get, to draft, your rookie draft is always based on this year's rookie class. Like those are two very different entities in the way you have to think about planning out your team and what you're going to be doing. So I know that's not like just a straightforward answer. So I think that context matters, a lot, but I still think that all the things that Jordan's talking about, are all the things that you've still got to think through. So Jordan, I'd be interested to hear from you. How do you place values, right, on a player? Because I think that's the hard part for people, right? Sometimes they're like, well, Zeke's this known entity. How do you baseline how long you think a player has left? You do something similar where you look at, okay, here's what the average NFL player that's done this kind of thing at this position, and maybe you do it on carries, age, seasons. I don't know how you do it, but how do you know when it's time to probably let go of a player is maybe the best way to ask this question.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I have a metric that I call density, which looks at once a player hits, sort of what arc does that put them on in terms of, once a first round running back hits, how many of those guys hit twice, how many of them hit 7 times, right? Like thinking about each of those things. And what you'll see is pedigree is both massive on the initial hit, and it's equally big effect on the sustained dense hit, right? So it's never ending, right? So that's probably the place that I would start with this question. The other thing that I think is really important when you analyze this rookie pick versus existing player, what's your aim? What are you trying to do? Right? Are you just trying to bail on Zeke? Well, trading him for 111 is a good way to do it. That's a good way to just run away. Or are you trying to retool? Right? Or are you contending right now? Right? All of those things change the calculus for how you should think about it. So I think, kind of like if you were rowing a boat, right? You want all of your decisions to be all of your oars going in the same direction, right? So if you're going to contend long term, or if you're rebuilding long term, but you sort of need to make that trade so that way it's aimed at contending long term. If you're trying to contend now, you need to think about your team contending now. That's not to say sell all your rookie picks, but I think there is a balance. I think it matters by year, it matters by the position in the class, it matters by the strength of the veterans. I do have a chart in my book that has basically your where the rookie pick goes compared to the veteran, which I think is really helpful, because then you can think about, in two neutral classes, right? If this is a neutral rookie class and a neutral startup class, right? Pick 111 is going to go somewhere in the late 90s in terms of a startup draft, and Zeke's going top 30. Right. So you sort of say, okay, I can't do that because it's just hemorrhaging value. And the other thing too, that I would say is like, as an initial jumping off point on Zeke, you sort of look at what the market says on him. And again, this is just using what's the information that's available before you even go into something super specific. I'm thinking about carries, thinking about all that stuff, is what's the hit rate where he's at, right? Like what's the odds that he hits a couple more times based on him being a second or a third round draft pick. And I have that in the book, and I think it's a great way to, thinking about base rates, thinking about easy things to just understand and evaluate decisions. That's another one, saying, the market has a lot of information. What does it mean for a person to be running back, being in the third round? What's their odds of hitting? What's their odds of that? Yeah. And then you can sort of measure it against the rookie pick, and you can sort of do that in a general sense. And then you can say, and then I like to start there with the rookie or with the Zeke value, and then say, okay, I can either move it up or down, but let's have a basis to start with. So using density and then using market price, I think combining those two give you a really good starting jumping off point.
Yeah. And Brian, I think the other thing, like for people, like, and I think about this a lot in Dynasty, is just, don't be in a hurry, like be patient, because a lot of times what will happen is like right now, and heading up to your dynasty drafts, like picks become more and more valuable to people because they want to have picks in the draft, right? Mm-hmm. So the price in a lot of these leagues will overinflate on what it takes to go get a rookie pick. Well, that also means you can sometimes sell a rookie pick for worth, at a price higher than really what it's worth. Whereas once the season starts, like people are much more willing to just start like doling out their picks, right? And they're going to be willing to overpay a lot of times for a proven commodity, because then you can target your trade partner, right? Then it's like these 4 teams are like on the cusp. If they had Zeke, wow, they have a real good shot at winning a championship. That's clearly going to Jordan's point, all of their oars are going in that direction. This is just adding on top of that, right? It's going to make sense to them. It makes sense to you. And if they think that's going to put them over the edge, you get a little more uncertainty in what kind of picks you're getting back, right? Because you could put them over the edge, right? But typically you can ask for more picks. Like that's just my experience. Like I haven't put it down into an exact science. Like, like Jordan, you may have actually looked at this kind of stuff, but like the timing of your trade, in my opinion, is really huge. Now it can depend on your league mates, but I've found that that's very beneficial to think about.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And what you'll see is, there's a really good graphic. I got to find it and retweet it, but it's essentially like a roller coaster, right? That it's basically what the value of a pick is. And it's essentially that it goes, it's going sort of along, and then it sees a big peak, and that's right at about April. And then there's a huge dip, and then it sort of goes along and it starts going up a little bit more. And then another huge dip, which is at the start of the next season. Right. And that's, you sort of doing the loop around in terms of looking at, how future picks or picks that haven't been made yet, what they are valued with. Generally speaking, something that you hit on, I wrote about, and like I said, I try to incorporate a lot of other strategies in, because I think a lot of it's applicable. But Sam Hinkie, the former GM of the Philadelphia 76ers, the basketball team, did basically, what's known as the process. Now, he never said it, but that's what it's been coined. He laid out his strategy actually when he resigned. He laid out his strategy. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was this phrase, the longest view in the room. And what you said is, and it's totally right, is you have to kind of think about a patience play. But if you have like a long view, right? If you have the longest view in the room, it doesn't even need to be that long to be really contrarian in Dynasty, because people get into this game and want to play forever, want to play all year round, do all these things, and then and then you'll hear them making, I made a drunk trade, right? Like it's all about instant gratification. You know what I mean? It's all about that. Or you're making a big push to do get help in season, right? And just hemorrhaging values, and I had a rookie slow start, and he's a bust, right? All of these things, right? If you sort of have the willingness to be patient, sort of, and look at profiles and think about how they actually arc, right? There's a ton of opportunity in that to be really different. And if you're playing a game where 1 out of 12 people win, and you're playing it for a long time, if you're different than everyone and you're right, like that's how you get really dominant. And so that's, I think having that strategy and sort of being willing to bucket, people say that I'm crazy for some of the stuff that I do. And maybe I will go to extremes on stuff that I wouldn't necessarily tell people to do, just because I feel comfortable there. Right. Cause I think I'm right. And I maybe might not necessarily suggest it to someone that's brand new. But I'll do stuff with positions, right? I will roster, if it's a 3 wide receiver league or a 2 wide receiver league, I'll roster 4 of them, and I'll roster 4x running backs, right? Because I sort of know what that opportunity presents itself, and sort of having that long view, and understanding kind of what players are worth in the arc that they're in, that can be a huge strategy advantage. Just having the longest view in the room.
I like that. Dwayne and I think we're in a Dynasty podcast league or something last year that started up, and there were people that got upset that there weren't like 10 trades a day. And I think there's that segment of the Dynasty population that thinks if you're not trading, you're not trying. And I think that's vastly incorrect to have that mindset, but to each their own. Hey, however you want to play.
Yeah. I'm with you on that. I actually saw a poll that was unbelievable. It was like the plurality of folks. It was like 35 to 40% said that winning was the most, winning the league was the most important thing in Dynasty. And then like 30% of people said like winning trades was the most important thing. And I'm like,
yeah.
What are we doing here? Like one is the ends, the other one is the means to the ends, and we're and I'm like,
it's like I made this really good one trade in the market, but overall my portfolio lost for the year. Like, who wants that?
Yeah,
right, yeah, and I call it sexy roster syndrome. And people will want to make these trades, and so they can tweet about it and tell, listen to how people say how great they are. It's like, it's not different from, modeling on Instagram, right? I mean, this is the same thing. And so you sort of get this, and you can sort of, and so for me, it's interesting because I sort of have a contrarian thing. I don't think value is important as people say it is. And so I don't think it's predictive, right? And so when I can sort of reject some of that stuff, and then it puts me in a place where I value things that are much more have shown to be have a higher ability to make you actually win games, and the market just doesn't appreciate that. And so I'm in a really contrarian position where I don't generate a lot of off-season trade activity because I'm valuing players that other people aren't, because I'm actually exploiting an efficiency, right? So it puts you in a weird spot sometimes. So I'm sometimes I'm feeling like I'm playing a game that other people are playing a totally different one. And, I think I'm right. And, we'll see how it bears out in the long term, but it's interesting when you sort of get into it, study the strategy, and you can see a lot of the things that are presumed to be true in Dynasty, just absolutely 100%. There's no factual basis for them.
It's so funny. The guy that hit you on Twitter within our thread, Brian McGrath. So he's he's in 2 leagues with me. And one of them, I traded him Zeke this year because I'm rowing the other way. I won like a couple of championships and it's like rebuilding time. And so we've talked about that topic, right? Mm-hmm. And then over in the other one, like I've just kind of built my roster in a different, I've just kind of gone in a little bit of a different direction. Like, and a lot of the stuff that you hit on, now, these are both IDP leagues, right? So all that stuff comes into play as well. But it's just funny, like all these things that we've been talking about, like it like literally comes up like all the time in every single league. Like, and it's all of the things that you put together plus timing. And I just think, like, you don't want to galaxy brain it. Like, I do think, to your point, there's a lot of things that are pretty simple and straightforward about it. But again, it's like, that's what I love about what you do. You're thinking about multiple paths. You're thinking multiple steps ahead. You're thinking more about the end game. Like really good chess players, right? They don't start by looking at the board the way it starts. They look at where they want it to end. And then they engineer all their moves based off that, and they just adapt, right, as their opponents make the different moves. And that's like how the greats play. And so I love all the stuff, right, that you're hitting on. So I am going to have to like double down and pay you extra money not to give Brian your content. No, I'm kidding. But what's bad is like now every person in my leagues or in both of my leagues will definitely, well, it's good for you. They'll probably buy your book. They'll all buy your book. It won't be good for me though, Jordan. It won't be good.
I'll buy your buy-in. It's fine. We'll work it out.
So why don't we talk a few players? Because I know everybody wants to talk, and if we want, we can talk a few players like from this year, and maybe talk a little bit about the value of them hitting, and get your thoughts about what that looks like moving forward, or maybe some players that didn't hit, and then we can talk a little about the rookie class. But one player that I know that really just came on at the end of the season, is Cam Akers. I mean, we can talk about the situation and all those other things, but just looking at Akers, looking at his profile, Akers is a guy that people were back and forth on a ton, right? Last preseason, right? It's like there's a camp of people that loved him. There was this camp of people that like, absolutely not. I'm never touching Cam Akers. So he did get an opportunity at the end of this year to really come on and take over the Rams backfield. Now, you did have an injury to Darrell Henderson. I saw a tweet today that Malcolm Brown's going to be gone. It's like, really, like, who? I don't even really care. It's like if somebody else could come in and work their way into a rotation. What are your thoughts on a player like Cam Akers and his value today versus what you think, it probably really is long-term?
Yeah, I think it's pretty high. I think it's pretty high. I was a fan of his, and it was really interesting because when you sort of looked at him, when you put the 4 guys together that were going up at the top of drafts that were second round guys. So Taylor, Akers, Dobbins, and Swift. At different points, they were all high, low, all over the place, right? And Taylor was 1, and then he was 3, and then he was 1, and then, they were all intersecting. Like just trading the between of those and recognizing they're all the same profiles would have been incredibly valuable. Pretty lucrative because there was a pretty big spread between them. But I thought that was notable. When you sort of look at guys that, second round guys that he's a not hit yet, right? So it's 43% of the time those guys have hit for a future season. So I definitely take the over on that. I think he's pretty, I don't think anything's certain, but I think if there's going to be one that I would put my chips in on that hasn't done it yet, I would take him. So that's, it's a good offense, right? And when you look at guys that are 22 years old that are lead running backs in a really good offense, they're going to be top 36 to 40 startup picks, right? That's kind of where you put them. I've seen them as high as 8. I think I have them right around 10, 12, somewhere in there. And there's debates that you can have in there, right? Derrick Henry falls in there, right? Some other guys, James Robinson falls in there, right? So I do think that there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of interesting debates. I would take an aggressive stance on him because I think his upside's really high, and I really, really like the player. And when you look at it, go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is what's interesting, and I think a lot of times people, I think some people make this connection, others don't. But a lot of times you can use like what you're seeing in redraft, right, to help you with Dynasty, and sometimes vice versa as well. But like Brian and I this year, that's what we talked about with folks. We were like, look, like you got to spend a first round pick on Clyde Edwards-Helaire. You got to spend a late second or an early third by the time everything was said and done with Jonathan Taylor. Both of them had competition in their backfield, right? Yeah, not great backs, but when you think about what backs are asked to do, you've got your long down and distance situations. You've got, your 2-minute offense. You've got a lot of things that, sometimes rookies, it's not because they won't eventually be capable, right? They're just absorbing all this stuff. And sometimes it can take time. And so Drake and I were really telling people, look, take Cam Akers and, DeAndre Swift in the 4th through the 6th rounds. Like if you really want to have a rookie back, like it's back to what you said earlier. Think about your opportunity cost is the way we put it. So if you're going to take Jonathan Taylor at the end of the 2nd, but you could draft DeAndre Hopkins and it's PPR, it's like, what are you really trying to accomplish? It's like, what are the chances that he's actually going to hit and be better than DeAndre Hopkins, right? That kind of thing. And same thing with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, right? And at the beginning of the, redraft year, he was a late second. And obviously that when we got the news, around COVID, and Damian Williams decided he was going to sit out, obviously that shot up to a mid, second round pick. And you look at the history of Andrew Reid backs, all that kind of stuff, him being a first round pick. I agree. I get the logic on where we were with Clyde Edwards-Helaire. But again, when you look at opportunity costs, like I was in a draft because I draft like 20 to 30 teams, so I was in a draft where somebody took CEH and left Alvin Kamara for me, like at 5. And I'm like, okay, awesome. So
you can't do that. Right?
Exactly. So I kind of just throw that out there because it is all back to that opportunity cost stuff. Right. And there are some parallels between what you see in redraft and then what you see, over in the dynasty leagues. And you even mentioned it earlier, right? Taking that step back. And even when you look back at ADP, I know a lot of times you're looking at not just, what the ADP was, for a dynasty league, but what the ADP was, right, even in redraft, right? And then the way those players played out in their first year. So anyway, sorry, I don't know where else I was going with that, Jordan, but I love looking at those parallels. So
yeah, no, I absolutely think that there is value there in terms of, one thing that I think market rates are really interesting, right? And especially when it's, I think some of the mock draft ADP, it's not that liquid. Sample size is small. Some of the incentives are not entirely where you want them to be in terms of it. I could go
playing poker for free. That's never
right. Good. Right. And I can go in there and totally jack an ADP provider by taking, Damian Harris at 104 in a startup draft. Right. And it totally screws up all the numbers. Right. Like I could do that if I want, and so there's some subversive things going on. Right. But when you get like a lot of sample of people playing, and so one of the things I use in season is start rate, right? So you get like MFL have like starter rate, and we've done I've done a good deal of research on this, and I have a metric called WARP, which is wins over replacement player, and it tells you basically how much based on how many players a person scores, how many wins they actually get you. And then I adjust that. So it's called AWARP, adjusted wins over replacement, which actually incorporates their starter rate. And so what you'll see is with any of these market rate things is you'll draw really important information out of it, which is, how good the market is, right? And what sort of, what it'll tell you. Well, ADP will tell you a lot about, what your expected hit rate might be, right? And understanding that it's actually telling you that it's really is a really important feature of it, right? And the type of investment that you're making, and the type of investment, because it's different by positions, right? So a 3rd round pick at wide receiver is different than a 3rd round pick at running back, right? Sort of knowing those things. And so that's really important with ADP. And then start rate is like a parallel to it, because it tells you, it's basically a proxy for what people think a player is going to do in a week, right? It's basically a proxy projection model, right? And knowing that information and sort of what that means, it's really helpful in terms of structuring your strategy and your decisions and making and building teams that can be highly effective. So yeah, I love those market rates, especially ones that are, have some liquidity and have the right, have the right incentives in place.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Drake.
People would kill me if I didn't get in the question that we got from multiple folks here. And it's very simple. Which players should we sell high on, and who should we be buying low on this offseason? If you got a couple of names on the tip of your tongue, you don't have to give it all away. But everybody I told today, I go, hey, we're doing a Dynasty show. What do you want to hear? Who am I buying high? Who am I selling?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I look at profiles, so I'm trying to think about looking at different profiles that I think are undervalued. I generally think that people write off wide receivers in their mid-20s who have multiple top 24 seasons. People write them off too early. So whether that's Mike Evans, whether that's Amari Cooper, probably DJ Moore to some extent. I think people are seeing him as a kind of a capped upside guy. We could debate that. Those type of players, especially guys that are still in their mid-20s, that they're not 29, so they're 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, somewhere in there, that's where they'll play their 2021 season. Those profiles, especially when you have a couple of hits under your belt, are pretty good. So that's a class of players that I really like to invest in. In terms of selling, Kyler Murray concerns me. I'm not sure he's there as a passer. So I get all the rushing stuff, but I probably wouldn't have him as high as he's going. I've seen him as high as 102. I can't get all the way there. I can't get to quarterback 2. So that's one. Logan Thomas, right? I mean, Dwayne, you what his yards per route run data was from PFF this year, and it's let's just say not good. So looking at some of the efficiency stuff, I mean, with him, like that's a classic one, right? And so I think one other way to think about it is guys who hit later on in their career that are sort of way outside, that are outlier hits, right? So you think about base rates when they're 3% hits. That's probably a good indication that that's a one-hit wonder profile, right? So that would be.
Here's a good one. What are you doing with David Montgomery?
So David Montgomery fascinates me, right? So David Montgomery, I wrote about him in this book because David Montgomery basically comes in as a rookie, and I'm like, this guy's not good, and he doesn't deserve to go in the top 3 of this class. I was like, the play on this class, and I wrote about it in 2020, right? Because that was the 2019 draft class. I call it the Harris Madison exacta. Was the play, right? Because you bail out of there, you get 2020 picks, and then I said the goal is to hit as many times as you can, hit Harris and Madison in all your leagues. And still incomplete results on that, but it's still early. But I didn't think David Montgomery was very good. So, but now, again, looking at profiles, now we have, and he was going, top 40, right? I mean, he was going pretty high in terms of startup drafts. So now he hits twice, right? He hits for a top 12 season. And now he's like running back, so I'm like, wow, that's a pretty good profile. Like I had him at running back, like real late teens, like early 20s, somewhere in that range. And people are like, you're the highest person in the market. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. I was like, how is that possible? I was like, you guys were all on him. And then he performs to expectation, what could reasonably be expected. Like he's over that 2 hits. That's really good for a start of their career. And everyone's bailing on him. And I'm like, I don't know. So for me, I think the profile is pretty attractive, right? Because he's on a pretty dense track already. And and one of the things I think with running back that we should think more and more about, especially because we're not sure how the running back market's changing in the NFL, is thinking about the commitment that a team's made, right? So he's under contract for 2 more years, right? So there's not a ton of guys kicking around that have that, right? I mean, there's rookies, right? But guys that are with established jobs that are under team control for 2 more certain years. Once you get to like 20 or 22, right after that, that situation's not that present, right? So, especially guys that have hit, right? So when you think about all those profile things, for me, he's pretty interesting in the next couple of years. Again, will I necessarily be on him in startup drafts? That's a really good wide receiver range, so maybe not. But I do think the profile is undervalued for sure, especially with people having him like in the 30s that I saw, which is just crazy to me.
Funny you mentioned David Montgomery. So Jordan and I, as I said at the top of the show, both live here in Syracuse, New York. And I actually took Jordan's spot in a radio station league this year that he won the prior year. And in that draft, I got David Montgomery, and I want to say the 8th round.
Yeah.
Like nobody
It was
wanted
when he was
to touch
hurt.
that guy.
Yeah, it was when he was hurt. Yeah.
Which, by the way, there's some real weirdos in that league, but shout out to the Man Child Show. Jim Lurch, great friend of mine, and Boy Green, big fan of the show.
I'm still a defending champion of that league. I just want to, it's just, yeah, because I had to leave. I had to leave.
Let me throw out a couple of quick names for you, and you can just say buy or sell. I know everybody out there, your league is different, and as Dwayne's profile says, context matters, but I just want to throw some interesting names out here. You tell me, in a general dynasty league, are you buying or are you selling? Michael Thomas.
Buying.
Because you got a quarterback issue there, and down year. How about Joe Mixon?
But by the way, quarterback hasn't mattered for Thomas. So notably, it hasn't changed. Breeze hasn't really helped him compared to the other guys he's played. Mixon, again, I think the cost matters. I question the upside, right? So if people are saying, hey, he's got top 6 upside, I don't think people are saying that anymore. So there might actually be some recency bias going on that actually drops him. I think he's somewhere between 12 to 15, 16, somewhere in that range. I think that's a fair spot for him in terms of value. So that would be where I would think about him. Again, he's a player that I think there's a wide range in value on. So just it's tough to say exactly if he's a buy or a sell, but that would be sort of the range that I would have him.
Carson Wentz. We've broken the show at this point.
David Montgomery and Carson Wentz in the same show.
I had been banging the drum that he wasn't good for about a year. So then this year happened and I almost feel bad. It was so bad. I'll say this: if he's going to be in like the late 20s of a startup draft, I think he's a buy. Outside of that, I don't think he's very good.
How about Russell Wilson?
He's a buy.
Juju Smith-Schuster, maybe going to a new team.
Yeah, that's a good question. Some of the metric stuff isn't great on him. He's one that if I could get something that I thought was fair value from him, I think it warrants considering that. I'm not going to bail. It's tough. If I could get a valuation somewhere in the teens for him, it's something I might consider doing. But I'm not going to just bail because I like the profile, but I think there's risks there. So, if you can get a player at ADP that you like, right, I think that's something that I would do. I would probably tend to move off of him at that, but I'm not just going to bail to get out of him.
Here's my last one, and then we'll see if Dwayne has any. Kind of a weird one. He's older, doesn't fit the profile of the guy you want to buy, but if Chris Godwin leaves Tampa, Antonio Brown with a full offseason slides in as that number 2 wide receiver, would you maybe want to buy or sell AB? Sure. Again, this is a short-term investment.
We want to give him the freedom of an offseason. Oh boy. I'm out on AB. I just don't want the headache.
There you go. Dwayne, anybody you're question about?
No, I mean, I would just throw it, to Jordan, any guys that are coming in, and again, because I don't want to spoil too much, with the book. We want people to go, invest in Jordan's work. So what about some of the rookies? Maybe name one rookie that you think, and again, I know it's difficult, right? Because we don't have draft pedigree yet, but you've done Breakout Age, you've done all these other things. So maybe give one receiver that you're pretty excited about, one running back, and if you just have one player that you're like, this guy's probably going to go too high for my liking.
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it. I think that looking at the receiver that I think is going to be cheap and pretty good is going to be Rondale Moore. So I think he's probably a later first rounder. If I had to guess right now, to second rounder type range, it's where I'm seeing him. I think it's where you guys have him. So he's one. I love the breakout stuff for him. I think some of the COVID opt-out stuff. I don't think we're going to hold that against players. I don't. That's a fine decision either way, whatever they wanted to do. I'm not going to ding people for a commitment or anything like that, but I do think it opens up an area of uncertainty that we have to think about in terms of some of these guys with being away for a year. So that's one. I think Etienne's really interesting at running back in terms of being he was good from a really young age. And he does basically everything. So I think that's pretty interesting. And I think he's going to be a fringe, maybe an early second round pick. And quarterback, a guy that I think is going too high. I think Devonta is going to probably go too high for me. I think the most interesting thing in the entire draft is going to be the spread between the top 10 quarterbacks. So if you get, where does Lawrence get? Lawrence is probably going to go 1 in a super flex draft. It appears to me that the market's really high on Fields compared to Wilson right now, which is interesting because I don't think that's how the NFL feels. So we'll see how that calibrates. It's going to be one I'm really interested in. And if Trey Lance is also up there too, if you get 4 guys in the top 10, sort of what that managing that situation is going to be pretty valuable. So that would be really the big storyline that I think I really, really need to watch and be invested in, figure out how to hit that, multiple times.
All right, we'll give you one more here from our pal Ryan on YouTube. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, please leave a comment, like the show, and if you can subscribe, that would help us immensely. He asks, what's Bryan Edwards' value moving forward? Early breakout in Ruggs. He's got Waller as the number 1 option there. So thoughts on the big man from South Carolina?
Yeah, see, here's the problem with pedigree, right? Like you can love the profile, but he goes in round 3 and that's a 24% hit rate for a rookie coming in, right? And you're just like, that really hits it. That really hurts it. And what happens is you're really susceptible to a lot of things. One of those is Nelson Aguilar coming in and getting more playing time than you, right? And so it's just really tough for these guys to get in there. Like I like Bryan Edwards' profile, but now he's going in round 3. That's really tough ask, right? And it's significantly different than round 2, right? And it's a steeper drop off around 1 as well. Like there are 3 tier breaks in there, and and that's a lot of bias that teams are putting in, right? That's not even me necessarily saying that he's worse as a player, but that's just a lot of the treatment that teams will have on these players. It's a reality of what they're dealing with. So even will we like them, we have to calibrate that. So we'll see. Maybe this offseason, I would take Ruggs over him just because the pedigree's more. They show more of an investment, even though Bryan Edwards may be the better player. But Nelson Aguilar. I mean, he's could potentially be back there, and that really pins Bryan Edwards in, right?
Anything else from you, Mr. McFarland?
No, man. No, just appreciate having you on, Jordan. Really great stuff. Man, I love how you go out and you look at these other markets and you just read other stuff from other intelligent people and see how you can apply that, right? Or assimilate that information, bring it back together and formulate that to help, folks with a strategy and just really putting together a process for Dynasty, man. I think you're doing some really great work, thinking about things, in a way that's really different, right, than a lot of folks do. Like I've spent a lot of times like in data and analytics and product management, like in my professional career. And like, that's what, we're always looking for, people that are willing to go look at all those sort of things. So I think it's just awesome that you've done this with Dynasty football. I think you brought a really fresh view to what, really Dynasty football is really all about. Right. And I think like my key thing with you, man, that I really love is like, people getting so hung up on thinking they really know, right? And it's such an inefficiency that you can take advantage of if you figure out who those people are, right, in your league, and you figure how locked on they are to somebody. Like that's like the time like you swoop in and you can do a lot. But I think just on a broader, from a broader sense, that's just so true, man. Just think about like how many misses there are. I've done this with my buddies. We've sat down and we've looked at like our drafts over like the last 7 years in the Dynasty leagues. And I remember sitting in the draft and how strongly we felt about certain players. And now looking back at it, it's like, man, like these hit rates are like terrible. Look at all the misses. Like we remember the hits, but like, look at all the misses. Like there's so many. So yeah, man, I love what you've done. Really great stuff.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah. The misses, like we talk about a total psychological impact. Like you remember the hits, but it shades out how many times you took that swing to make that hit. You know what I mean? You forget the strikeout rate a little bit there. So it's definitely an interesting thing to know.
Folks, I want you to go over to analyticsofdynasty.com. For $20, you can get his 2020.
The 21 edition's $30.
$30. I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong one. Now I'm scrolling down here. $30. You can get the 20, the new one. Hey, if you want a half an hour session where you want Jordan to break things down for you with your individual team, you can buy that on there. I mean, that's just great stuff that not a lot of other content providers are giving out these days, and we really appreciate the time. We've had the biggest of big names come on this show, Jordan. And I have to say that, the hour and 10 minutes we've spent with you has been so enjoyable, so informative. And I put you up there with anybody we've had on the show. And not only are you a Syracuse guy, so if you want to hang out, guys, later, we are going to talk a little Syracuse ACC basketball. Dwain, you can stick around for the lacrosse talk. They're preseason number 3 in the country. So that's all going to be here on the after show. But Jordan, thank you so much for hanging out with the Fantasy Football Hustle, man. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me so much. I really appreciate it, guys.
All right, folks. We'll see you guys back next time. For Dwain, for Jordan, I am Brian. Never get out hustled. We'll see you next week.